At the end of our discussion of episodic memory, there's a couple of final aspects I'd like to discuss. And these are the abilities to date events on a reference calendar and to estimate the duration of events. And these capabilities mean we can answer questions like, when did a specific event occur? Was it before or after some other event? Or how long did the event go on for? An important way in which we establish the relative timing of events is to establish a range of internal time maps. Most of us have lived in a number of different houses in the course of our lives, and we can use the sequence of houses in which we've lived as a way to locate events in time. What we can do is identify which house we were living in at the time, and then did such and such an event happen while we were living at a particular house. For example, if an event happened while we were living at this house, it must have been before an event that happened while we were living here. And there are other time frameworks that we use: where we went to school, where we worked, marriages, births of children, deaths of family members, great successes and problems. So let's have a look at the mechanisms employed in this simple cortical model, with column receptive field detections at a number of different levels of complexity. When you moved to one of the places you lived, lots of columns expanded their receptive fields, and many of them were often active and expanded while you were living there. Suppose we illustrate those columns for one home in pale blue. If the name of the specific home is heard, or it's initiated by some other population, some subset of these columns will tend to be activated. If you've often talked about the date you lived there while thinking about the place, these columns can acquire recommendation strengths in favor of saying the years in which you lived there, among many other recommendation strengths, of course. Now, suppose you're recalling a particular event, and the recall process activates the red columns. And let's suppose the event took place in the period when you were living at the home corresponding with the blue columns. Now, I'll keep these specific home blue columns coloured, although they're not active at this point. Suppose also that an auditory population, such as would be activated by hearing a word like home, is activated, and this auditory population indirectly activates a population in these same areas on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity. This could result in the pink population of columns illustrated, and this pink population will include a weighted average of all the homes ever lived in, and will generally include a small number of the blue columns as shown. This small number will have recommendation strengths in favour of, for example, talking about the specific home, or saying the dates when it was home. But the small number means that these recommendation strengths in total won't be particularly great. The red event columns, like any columns, will have recommendation strengths in favour of indirectly activating columns that expanded their receptive fields in the past somewhat later than they did, among many other recommendation strengths, of course. And the columns recommended for activation on this basis will include some columns corresponding with the home lived in at the time, again among many others. The pink home columns will have recommendation strengths in favour of indirectly activating columns that were often active in the past at the same time as they were. And the recommended columns will include columns corresponding with the homes lived in at the time of the event, some with fairly weak recommendation strengths, and columns corresponding with all the other homes will also be recommended to varying degrees. Now, suppose that these two types of indirect activation behaviours are accepted simultaneously, one type for each population, and together they drive a third population, which I will colour orange. The third population will tend to include columns that are recommended for activation by columns in both the other two populations. In other words, columns that correspond with a home and expanded at around the same time as the targeted event. So the combination of recommendations will tend to favour activation of a population of columns that are past homes lived in around the time of the target event. And this orange population will therefore tend to have a fair amount of overlap with the blue population, the columns often active when in the place that was home at the time of the event. So this orange population will have significant recommendation strength in favour of saying the approximate date for the event. So the combination of column activation steps can generate recommendation strengths in favour of saying the rough date of the event. The actual process used to reach such a speech behaviour could be more complex and will probably be recorded in the cerebellum. A key point at this stage is that information processes limited to the allowed types of indirect activations are capable of supporting this type of cognitive behaviour. But another thing to bear in mind is that the columns are partially ambiguous in behavioural meaning, and there isn't actually a guarantee that this process will lead you to the cognitive result you're aiming for. Sometimes you may not be able to recall the date of a particular event. The various combinations of processes are ways the brain has identified to use partially ambiguous information to work towards appropriate responses to cognitive tasks. And to address the issue of how we estimate lengths of time in the absence of aids like clocks, first I want to consider the rate at which the brain defines conditions. And the brain is constantly defining new conditions and adding them to the set which it detects. And once added, there's a strong tendency for the condition to be retained. The number of pyramidal neurons in the cortex is about 10 billion. And one neuron has about 40 branches. So the number of branches is about 400 billion. If each branch was a separate condition, and assuming about 2 billion seconds of awake brain experience in a lifetime, this would imply the ability to record information at an average rate of the order of 100 conditions per second. Of course, that's a very, very rough estimate, and it'll be much less if the environment is very familiar and much higher in a novel environment. But there are a couple of implications, even from this very rough estimate. Firstly, there is a limit to the information that can be recorded over a lifetime, and the phenomenon of older people being less able to recall recent events seems to be consistent with running out of capacity. The problem is that it's behaviourally risky for the brain to discard conditions, because any condition has recommendation strengths in favour of many different behaviours, and the recommendation strengths of any condition might include recommendations in favour of some critical survival behaviours. And the brain has no way to identify less important conditions which perhaps could be deleted and the resources reused. Now, a second implication is that the rate of condition recording could perhaps be used as a kind of proxy to estimate the passage of time, but with some important limitations. For example, during current experience, it will feel that time is passing much more slowly if there's relatively low rate of condition recording, in other words, in a period with little novelty. And time will seem to pass much faster during novel experiences, which could account for the feeling that time is dragging when you're bored with nothing to do. However, looking back on experiences, if the interval between two events is estimated from the number of columns indirectly activated on the basis of receptive field expansion after the first event until the second event, this will indicate that time passed quickly during boring events and more slowly during novel events, which could account for the subjective feeling that time passed more slowly when we were younger, in other words, when more of the environment was novel to our brains, which accounts for the apparently contradictory experiences that time seems to pass rapidly during a novel experience, but in retrospect the experience seems to have taken a long time, and vice versa for boring experiences. So once again, the higher level models can give us an understanding of even subjective experience in a way that we can map to more precise understanding at anatomical and physiological levels. So that concludes the discussion of episodic memory, and now we'll move on to procedural memory and priming in the following sections.